social media later on. Yeah. But before we start, I just want to quickly present our group, TULE, Trade Unions Labor Environmentalism Network, and another event that we have scheduled in a couple of weeks. We are a newly formed group of early career researchers. We are from all over the world, conducting research on labor and the climate crisis or labor and environmentalism. We have organized a conference and co-sponsored some events in the past, and we will continue to do so, to organize events, conferences, panels, and hopefully publish together in the future as well. So please stay tuned. We will upload these events and past events in our website. I will post all of this in the chat later, all the social media and Facebook and IG and Blue Sky and everything where you can follow us. In case you want to be informed with our events. And if any of you here is an early career researcher, as we are, and you're interested in the network, you can send us a message because we're very much still welcoming new members to our network. And one information is that we want to invite you all also to another event we're co-sponsoring with the Norwegian geographer Ståle Holgersson. He is touring North America these next weeks to discuss his new book, Against the Crisis, which discusses and navigates different Marxist theories of crisis and socialist strategy. This event is in person in Toronto on April 11, 7 p.m., but there will also be an online link, so you will be able to listen to it online as well. I will post all of this in a couple minutes in the chat. And yeah, I think that was it from my side. So without further ado, Keith, you have the floor.
Thanks, Nicole. And thanks, Vinny and TULE, for organizing this. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces and new faces here. So I work full-time for Labor Notes as a labor climate organizer. And before jumping into the talk, wanted to share something I'm excited about that just went to press yesterday, which is, can you see this sneak preview I'm giving you of the Labor Notes Jobs and Climate special issue?
Yeah.
Yeah, really excited about having this go to press. So it's the first time we've done a full issue of this magazine on rank and file perspectives on fighting the boss to win climate demands at work, whether it's around safety or transition terms. So we'll love to get some feedback from you all if anybody gets to read that too. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. This talk is based on about 8 years of research I've been doing in California, San Joaquin Valley, talking to hundreds of different construction workers, activists, and local politics. And this is the newest research chunk out of that based on research I did last fall. So without further ado, where this starts is that there is no point in sugarcoating that the reigning climate strategy of the political center left in the global north is in an open crisis right now. Whether in the European Green Deal or the US Inflation Reduction Act, a program of publicly subsidized, privately owned clean energy with modest to no labor standards has brought solar, battery, and electric vehicle build out to record heights. But the strategy has been a political flop, failing to consolidate a working class front for climate action, let alone stem a rising far right. Activists and scholars on the political left have tended to make a parallel but lesser misstep. A frequent focus has been on cooking up programs, policy ideas to bond a coalition of existing activists. There are about 1,000 bespoke versions of a Green New Deal, many of them stirred by Naomi Klein's inspiring call that a program could be, quote, a vision to both unite movements that are not currently in conversation with one another and to dramatically expand all their bases. A shared logic polls Fred Stafford's nuclear advocacy to woo union officers to the green cause, and Malcolm Harris's new book, which touts a climate alliance of liberals, socialists, and anarchists as a path forward. The underlying error in all of these, even though they come to different answers, has sort of two steps to it. One is assuming that existing movements can be enough. and that they need the right policy platform to glue them together. To break fossil capital and end the climate tailspin, the missing force needed in all of these strategies is class formation, which means more working people organized into action on our own terms. As Leo Panitch and Sam Gindin wrote just before the Green New Deal platform frenzy began, quote, escaping this crisis of the working class is not primarily a matter of better policies or better tactics. It is primarily an organizational challenge to facilitate new processes of class formation rooted in the multiple dimensions of workers' lives that encompass so many identities and communities. For researchers and activists, this makes for pressing questions. How do new working people shift their politics, stick together, and step into the fight together? Concretely figuring out how these happen is urgent, and nowhere more so than in the unions with job site leverage over a climate transition. In rebuilding the world or doubling down on fossil peril, construction workers in particular have the most hands-on leverage imaginable. But across North America and much of the world, building trade officials, construction union officials, have been those most notoriously partnered with dirty capital, even as center-left strategies have been most keenly focused at winning over these same unions. But giving up on the immense potential of union transformation, even in the building trades, is no option. As the pages of labor notes have written up for 4 decades, members of unions can turn around the most moribund or defensive unions into unique engines of working class fighting spirit. And we need to learn from grounded experience how unions take steps into class formation, climate action, or both. We can start from a leading example for that reigning center-left strategy on labor and climate. One of its model frontrunners, its core models, was the California solar power boom, power plants built in the 2010s in particular. These were publicly mandated, privately owned, and over 90% unionized, unlike the vast anti-union majority of US solar. California construction unions grew enough that by 2018, their officers backed a state law for 100% zero carbon electricity by 2045. This sounds like a best case scenario for the strategy. As I wrote with Sarah Holiday Nelson in Environmental Politics a few years ago and explore in depth in my forthcoming book, Solar Flux, in the late 2010s, California's San Joaquin Valley became an unlikely best case scenario for class formation from the center-left climate strategy. This was the same terrain that Ruth Wilson Gilmore and John Steinbeck had written about as a sort of canonical case of repression of a working class immigrant majority by a landowning right-wing elite. But in just 5 years, building trade unions secured or seized on a solar and high-speed rail boom to double and diversify their active membership. They then powered an immigrant, labor, and environmental justice coalition, very rare in electoral politics, that ousted scores of right-wing developer cronies from municipal governments. But in the early 2020s, that astonishing progress stalled into what a local activist told me was a quagmire. In this paper, based on the newest chapter of the book, I looked to worker and union activist perspectives to find where the best version of the center-left climate strategy fell short on class formation, first in the workplace, then in the state. Unionization of solar jobs was a key start, and labor's electoral opportunities were real and plenty. But those weren't enough on their own to sustain class formation against management offensives at work, elected allies drifting away, and union officers sliding into sectionalism for their own trade. Heading off that kind of labor sectionalism is fiercely urgent, given the pressures labor officers face now to collaborate with resurgent right-wing governments. That risk was luridly shown in a recently leaked memo of North American building trade heads, boasting that their plan was to, quote, remain silent and seek collaboration with the Trump administration, even as they acknowledged it has killed or stalled over $100 billion of union construction jobs. Understanding the roots of this solar stasis in California's most promising case is a key start at moving beyond the crater of center-left energy politics so far and into a virtuous cycle of climate action and class formation. Going to quickly pull up an image here to set the tone. All right. Okay, here's a photo of a solar project in between Fresno and Bakersfield in the valley. This next section is called A Solar Boom Decoupled. The defensive turns for labor began from a plateau at work. In the late 2010s, the explosive growth of San Joaquin solar plants and high-speed rail opened the way for iron workers to double their active ranks, while the electrical workers grew by almost a quarter in membership. Then in 2022, or from 2022 to, or 2020 to 2022, the last years we have data on, workers brought new solar plants online at twice the speed as the 4 years prior. The boom got faster, but union membership flattened out in the same period. I'm going to show you, this is the electrical workers membership, which had been significantly increasing in the late 2010s and then starting to plateau. And then iron workers who build the racking systems, the structures that support solar panels, you see an even steeper sort of plateau in the same period with twice the pace of solar power plant construction. It's also important to note that the IBEW membership figures here, this growth reflects not just sort of full union members at full pay, but also their fast-growing lower tiers of solar workers who largely didn't become long-term members at full pay. So even these numbers are somewhat inflated. How did solar growth decouple from union growth? One factor was a management push for more overtime. Union officers largely abided this overtime push. As a top agent of the Bakersfield electricians, Brian Holt told me, quote, solar developers now often want 6 10s or 6 10-hour shifts per week. If members know that that's the deal when they sign up, we expect them to stick with that. Even if overtime wages were often 50% above standard wage, overtime kept the pace faster and the costs of healthcare, recruitment, and training lower for solar developers. And with more overtime alongside a speed up in production rate, developers could lay far more panels with the same number of hands. Meanwhile, dangerous heat waves scorch solar labor. As the climate crisis sped up fast, Fresno spent an average of 60 days per year over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the early 2020s, a third higher than just a decade prior. Some Southern California solar contractors shifted to avoid the rising heat with nighttime construction under floodlights, but that practice was nearly unheard of in the valley. Holt, the electrician's officer, said that heat and the quick pace of work were common reasons that new solar workers quit in their first few months. While he said contractors followed state mandates to provide extra breaks, shade, and cold water during heat, speed up and overtime in the sun-baked fields made work unavoidably searing for the workers who remained. In the solar fields, laborers handle much of the heaviest digging and material hauling. And they often get the lowest pay. By their trucks in Fresno, a crew of laborers said they'd felt the heat turn more brutal in recent years. A solar veteran, Jose Hernandez, told me one of the foremen in the union, a real beast of a guy, one of the best workers, he got heat stroke out on a solar job and he's been forever changed. Many had encouraged a coworker to take a voluntary break at the first sign of trouble, but no solar worker I asked knew of union demands or collective actions to challenge the pace or hours of work during heat waves. Mounting friction over turf between union trades also frayed union growth in this period. In 2021, soon after electing a new statewide leader, the carpenters left the State Building Trades Council and its tacit peace treaty across crafts, largely to push housing legislation that would help carpenters lower paid tiers get hired over other trades. Solar unity was a casualty of that housing battle. The carpenters left the five-craft agreement for solar project turf that had reigned nearly a decade and kept a peace between unions. Carpenters had a vision to build some solar projects with a majority of carpenters rather than their previously minor roles as panel motor installers on these jobs. That kind of labor sectionalism was exacerbated by opportunistic collaborations in politics. In the Fresno Area Building Trades Council, most leaders fumed after the local head of the council from the electrical workers struck a private deal with Republican city officials to voluntarily cut out smaller public construction projects from a landmark citywide union labor agreement that was won just 2 years prior. As local labor activist Randy Heald griped with me, that guy is much closer to the Republican power structure. His whole strategy is to work those relationships. Slow growth beyond the solar fields also flattened membership. We can't just look at solar in a vacuum. We have to look at work demand across the whole trade and its landscape. For the whole early 2020s, construction jobs on the whole grew by single-digit percentages across the area. Yet energy storage projects grew 20-fold in less than 4 years here, mostly with batteries at solar projects. Growing battery jobs were largely unionized, but mostly quick ones. And despite a much trumpeted expansion of public infrastructure funding under the Biden administration, for San Joaquin unions, this largely translated to sustaining high-speed rail and fixing existing roads and schools. Federal funds helped stabilize membership rather than surge it higher in this period. A similar problem struck nationally as construction unions actually lost membership overall nationally in 2023 and 2024, which were the peak years of the Inflation Reduction Act build-out. In their early years, construction unions grew their membership not through policy handouts, but through non-union workers unionizing their own shops through collective action. Like most of the United States, that kind of, quote, bottom-up new organizing was nearly unheard of in San Joaquin building trades. In a rare exception in 2023, Fresno Metal Works was organized by a foreman and workers furious over safety problems and low wages, which did get local union backing, but didn't have ripple effects elsewhere. Top-down organizing, where union officers privately appealed to construction bosses to go union, remained the bog standard strategy in the region and the state. In 2023, after years of courtship, the head of Bakersfield Electrical Workers wooed their biggest competitor employer to sign a union contract, in part with a pledge for friendly collaboration. As Officer Brian Holt put it, we're not how IBW used to be. We're not turn 'em and burn 'em, which is how the trades used to target non-union shops with lawsuits and permit fights to try and force them into the union. Those tactics of holding environmental permits hostage as leverage had been core to how California unions had unionized the solar fields a decade before. But that weapon had now been sheathed. Compared to a decade before, when a new crop of Latino leaders had won internal elections in the ironworkers and another few local unions, the early 2020s solar stasis was also sleepy for internal building trade politics. As far as I learned, no major internal reform challenges, rank and file caucuses, or top leadership shifts arose in this era, except for one new top officer in the non-solar trade of the sheet metal workers. That placidity, despite plateauing or worsening conditions on the job, attested to a membership rarely yet organized on its own behalf. Hesitant to challenge employers over speed up and heat, or even to organize non-union workers, construction unions struggled to grow beyond their new solar plateau. For local labor and environmental activist Sam Forbes, that was a historic missed opportunity. Quote, "This is the ripest moment to push employers. The labor market is so tight that even the threat of a strike gets employers keeling over in a few days. Fresno teachers just did this. But building trades are so close with employers that have no ambition to do that. The carpenters are so partnered up, it's hard to tell where they end and their developers begin. In avoiding conflict with employers, building trade officers' hope for growth became even more dependent on legislative nudges for more union work. But parallel to their plateau at work, unions hit skids in regional politics that challenged their hopes for a peaceable path to growth. The next section is called Politics Retrenched. The labor movement broke into San Joaquin politics with a vengeance in the late 2010s. Booming solar unions allied with care sector unions, immigrant and environmental activists to win nearly 3/4 of their challenges to incumbents across 4 counties in California. Reflecting back, local alliance builder Daniel O'Connell beamed, "The Fresno Chamber of Commerce, the old guard, we've shattered that." Fresno City Council flipped to a steady pro-union majority in 2020, and that was the crowning win. It reversed anti-union laws passed first in the nation in this city. But by 2024, these advances were slowing to a crawl. The Fresno Region Labor Council racked up about the same rate of wins in 2022 and 24, but ran a third fewer races for more substantial offices like mayors or city councilors. And winning beyond the cities looked especially tough. Quote, "We won the low-hanging fruit, all the districts that had big demographic shifts and some labor attention," said O'Connell. Fresno Labor Council leader Dylan Savory saw a long road ahead based on where members and power resided. Quote, "In the small towns, there's just too little at stake for labor to get invested." After 2020, union candidates stayed stifled as ever in the small towns and in the medium-sized city of Bakersfield. Nidia Chicas, a young painter who lived in the 12,000 person Mendota, an hour west from Fresno, said that her neighbors were mostly farm workers and 10 to 15% construction workers. "I'm surprised it doesn't get hit at all with campaigns. We get almost no lit." Chicas went canvassing in Fresno, but knew of no union campaigns to organize or on near home. In 2024, Trump won Fresno County, the first Republican to win the presidential vote there in 20 years. This was a grim sign of class de-alignment emerging in what had been a solar hotbed with rising labor. Writing red coattails with joint billboards. One sec, pulling up a image here. Local right-wingers, including a growing Latino cast, largely cruised on exurban votes to state and congressional wins. Labor had yet to show how to turn its urban gains into a working-class spark in the backlands, even those most transformed by solar and rail. Union leverage in politics was held back by stubbornly low member involvement, especially from construction unions. Although ironworkers stood out among building trades for member canvassing, in 2024, many settled on mere lit drops, leaving pamphlets at doors as a lower pressure alternative to front porch conversations. Among other unions, in-home care workers with the service employees were often a majority of canvassing troops for labor, while teachers split off in this period to run their own endorsements and field work altogether. Let's see. All right, here's an image from a canvas at the Labor Council about to head out. All right, complicating any electoral offense were increasing strains between unions and the new crop of candidates they'd helped to elect. As Fresno Labor Council activist Randy Heald put it, getting them into office is one thing, now keeping them accountable is what we're figuring out. Between careerism and state budgets swinging wildly, even as California's tech and real estate profits surged over this era, Labor's candidates in city office were hard-pressed to deliver more than a few sidewalks and park upgrades for the barrios, far from a sweeping social democratic transformation that some had stood for as Bernie delegates just a few years before. The pendulum had swung, This most startling development were labor's novel dalliances with a few Republican candidates. For a county supervisor race between two GOP diehards, unions threw in behind Gary Bredefeld, a challenger the Labor Council had admitted was, quote, arch MAGA. But he can't vote on any of the social issues locally, and he can vote for us on labor issues locally. Republicans now get that they need us or else they'll lose. We can work with them sometimes, but keep building up our own labor candidates. So the pendulum had swung towards union power in a few cities, but was slowing towards a new stasis. The challenges of rural organizing, languid member involvement, and a patchy hold on their own candidates risked a turn where unions sought their own narrow gains, even through collaboration with former right-wing foes. A practical ebb away from labor's alliances with environmental and immigrant organizations was plainest in San Joaquin Valley battles over massive energy, housing, and transportation plans from local developers. These were the realms of Reconstruction most pivotal in the 1,000 proposals for a Green New Deal, yet it was precisely there that California unions and their allies felt most silent at offering working class alternatives for the course of new construction. On housing, powerful local developers pushed to turn 9,000 acres of farmland into 45,000 new sprawl homes, none guaranteed affordable, with the city shelling out for new roads and water pipes from scratch. On transportation, business groups and city officials, including some union endorsees, pushed a sales tax laser focused on road repaving, not public transit. On the energy front, a set of the largest farm clans proposed converting their land to solar power plants on a scale tenfold any prior project in the region, what would potentially be the largest solar project in the country, but with no new labor standards and few community concessions. Fossil companies announced huge carbon capture plans around Bakersfield and readily won state and federal subsidies to squeeze new profits from their old oil fields and gas plants. These plans pledged to retrench the power of the same landowners and corporate dynasties who had viciously busted unions and run politics in the valley for generations. Yet unions offered little alternative vision to these capitalist mega plans, while their allies in office largely drifted to support each. Although a Fresno Labor Council leader internally floated the idea of a public utility study around solar generation, reps from the Electrical Workers Union for the behemoth private utility, Pacific Gas and Electric, vetoed the move, objecting firmly to any carve-out from their employer's turf in their existing contract. That reflected union fears of an austere public sector delivering worse deals for labor than the Wall Street capitalized current boss. That also showed the confines of partnerships between union and employer that left little air for worker initiative, and the limits of inter-union politics that were kept to conflict-averse back rooms. Local environmental justice nonprofits voiced the fiercest public opposition to each of these new plans for the region and could often mobilize a few dozen or even 100 supporters in protest, but without the deep ranks and dues money of unions, environmentalists struggled either to slow developers or to offer a popular alternative with teeth. This rough episode showed that policy programs could have use after all, not as abstract visions to initiate a movement, but as products of movement, to rally working class forces around their own alternatives to capitalist blueprints. For all their strides, California building trades had yet to grow sufficient hunger or capacity to plot their own blueprints. All right, and the concluding section, a breakthrough housebroken. Right after a solar boom powered a labor insurgency in politics, union progress slowed to a crawl. Even as solar grew faster, building trades plateaued in membership, conceded on management speed up via overtime, and stepped back from alliances towards more sectional, selfish campaigns on their own behalf. After bringing a bumper crop of new city officials into office, labor as a whole struggled to champion an alternative economic path or to widen movement building to the backlands. This showed that solar growth, even unionized and at a scale rivaling nearly anywhere worldwide, could not guarantee class formation or amass climate politics. Those were active goals for a small cadre of union officers and nonprofit organizers. And they made impressive strides in the 2010s at building an alliance on those terms. But those advances at the top had yet to build depths in the union ranks. 100,000 union members were organized, but not organizing, not to challenge bosses on their scorching job sites, and rarely to organize their neighbors in politics. Without building that engine of members in motion, pressure mounted on labor leaders to eke out narrower wins by collaborating with a lingering white wing establishment. Instead of political independence against a landed elite that aimed to galvanize a working class majority into power, unions, and particularly building trades, slowly veered towards a more barren, bipartisan kind of independence, playing off politicians for union jobs and little more. This foresages a national and perhaps even an international problem for union climate politics. With Biden in office, national officers in the building trades focused on reaping help from above as dutiful allies. A tight labor market and public construction subsidies meant opportunities, in theory, to grow unions, but construction unions as a whole instead actually lost members in those peak Biden build-out years. As right-wing reactions spread within working class quarters, union leaders became less willing to fight internally over national and class-wide political issues in favor of narrower local goals for more jobs. California's best case scenario for center-left climate strategy shows that unionized clean energy booms are not enough alone. Where unions historically rose for environmental and class-wide politics, like the oil, chemical, and atomic workers' push that won OSHA in the United States, or the Australian builders, laborers of green bans fame, it took a long record of job site militancy and member political formation to make greater leaps possible beyond this kind of plateau. For researchers committed to building labor's power for the climate, this sets some parts of an agenda. We can seek more examples of political transformation among union members, especially keen to the roles of workplace militancy and internal democracy. We can work alongside unions and member caucuses to provide research, data, and support for member-made blueprints, ones that challenge capital's vision for development in a grounded way. With honest debate, we can challenge climate strategies and policy ideas that neglect class formation or that wrongly assume it easily follows a union jobs boom or a pleasing program. The toughest task for us researchers may be humility, to know that our position outside union ranks is no match for the collective trust and power possible inside. Initial breakthroughs in California building trades were possible only because of union activists with a class war vision, if a modest one, and their cred to rally coworkers. In that light, where we work with students and activists outside labor, we can encourage and support them to seek union jobs in pivotal sectors, or at very least partnership with union workers in a deeper way. Our calling is to help these bedrock organizations of the working class live up to their atmospheric potential. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Keith, so much for the great talk. We're going directly to Vinny, right? You're ready, Vinny? Okay. I will let you know 2 minutes before 15 minutes, something like that. So you know.
Sure. Yeah, thanks a lot, Keith, for that. Thanks for everyone turning out. Happy to see a lot of familiar faces and folks I don't know, but hope to organise alongside. Yeah, this was really impressive, Keith. Really looking forward to the book now. Yeah, perhaps we can have you back for a book lunch. But yeah, no, that was excellent. Yeah, I think you kind of set it up there at the end well with the kind of contribution you're making in terms of challenging this idea, right, that the solar boom is going to automatically mean a renewed labour movement, a fighting class war formation of a labour movement. And I think you do a good service to take that to task. So that's excellent. So yeah, just with my time, I think I'll start off by making a kind of like three, four main kind of points about the chapter Keith sent over for folks listening his chapter ahead of time. And so, yeah, I'll go through a couple of things there, throw in a couple of questions as I go, and then I'll finish up with kind of three main questions. Feel free to take what you want from that. But yeah, also excited to hear what other folks think. Yeah, so you start off by critiquing Naomi Klein, Malcolm Harris, Fred Stafford, and others, and you challenge them as making a two-step error, assuming this existing movements are not enough, and they just need the right policy platform to glue them together. And of course, like yeah, what comes up obviously is the late great Jane McAlevey in terms of again, it looks like with a lot of the kind of solar boom, unions are just looking for shortcuts. And yeah, as Jane McAlevey put it, there are no shortcuts. And the primary function should be class formation based on organising. And yeah, you lean on Toronto-based Sam Ginden and late Leo Panich and yeah, I really appreciated that how you talked about how new working people shift their politics, stick together, and step into the fight. And yeah, I completely agree on the necessity of class formation rather than say, I think you see this argument around around like we just need to build union density, build numbers, get people in unions, and I think as important as that is, we negate the class formation component of that. And Sam Ginden loves to kind of point out in response to that argument that just because and point to the kind of Canadian unions as having higher density than the US unions, but that hasn't really transpired into a more robust labour movement, right? So I agree with that, but I suppose my question is, and that I'll finish off that kind of section, uh, is that obviously these shortcuts are kind of taken out of desperation. Let's just put them all together, the movement of movements. How do we not fall into that kind of trap? In terms of non-union movements, is the answer just to funnel non-union movements into unions? Is the answer, as many kind of argue, the answer to this moment is the best thing to do is join a union? Do you see room for union, like a movement of movements? Suppose I would ask you that, particularly with the kind of the kind of broad picture of the climate crisis and the many kind of ways it will affect working class people. The next kind of theme I want to kind of look at is unions. This kind of broad theme is unions as rational actors, right? And you kind of like critique this. They're meeting their members' interest, but of course this plays in, and you have a really good depiction of sectionalism. And in my own work, I look at labour coalitions and what's kind of coming out of kind of early research is how, as labour coalitions, they can actually, through this kind of getting in a room, deciding on turf, how this can be a tool of kind of defending against a lot of this kind of sectionalism. And yeah, that part where you had the like, yeah, very kind of frustrating. I'm sure it was painful for all the other workers involved, where you had that kind of five craft agreement undercut. So yeah, well, as you know, once that trust is gone, it's very hard and it can last like decades. So I suppose the question kind of there is, how do workers challenge this? Did you see any examples of workers? You talked about the kind of small cadre of kind of like that were kind of fighting for this kind of class vision and class formation. Did you see any examples of kind of proactive, maybe within workplaces, as like a recent piece by Jordan House and Paul Gray look at workers within Rutgers. Did you see any of that kind of coalitions building within workplaces? And in that vein, I suppose, the biggest issue here, you bring up the kind of green bands, tech, and then another one that kind of comes up in a lot of these kind of discussions is from the UK, and we've got a lot of UK listeners, participants here, is the Lucas plan, right? How do we get unions to like act more broadly? And yeah, that kind of issue of overtime, I just wanted to like yeah, kind of probe like again, how do we kind of fend off that very immediate interest of making an extra kind of couple of dimes, as important as that is. But then I also wanted to tie that to, you said there was some kind of organizing around health and safety, but there was discrepancies, I suppose, within the union in terms of when they would pick that up, when they wouldn't. Why, like, unions like love to, and rightly so, it's a great history of like they kind of just transition, and you talked of like that Tony Mazzocchi, but why is that kind of like, why is there a discrepancy? It seems like such an open goal in terms of like moving these workers, the extreme heat, moving these workers to night shift, like and uprooting all the kind of social reproduction implications. Why wasn't that used as an organising moment? Were workers at the rank and file talking about that? Was that like blocked in the very kind of again amidst kind of like narrow interest? Maybe you can expand on that. But yeah, really interesting. And I suppose the last part that I want to focus on is this kind of political orientation of unions. Something like, yeah, we're kind of like struggling with here in Ontario as we just had another majority government by the right wing Doug Ford Conservative government, and he pulled union support. I mean, it's not new. Like this kind of third election victory, and he's pulled union support again from these kind of building trades, acting in kind of narrow interest. And yeah, I think the like I wonder how you see it from like to kind of borrow Vincent Bevan's kind of recent book about a year ago, If We Burn, who kind of talks about this idea that there is no political vacuum, the right sit within it. So is it a case of like we are not organized, therefore the right takes that political vacuum, or the right is in that political vacuum and is able to build that power, and we're now seeing that like win more and more kind of like struggles frustratingly and have unions when do you see it as that? And yeah, what are the kind of lessons for fighting that kind of right wing takeover of unions? Yeah, I'm interested again in that. And then I suppose the kind of what is to be done, right? Like how do you look at, how do you analyze the moment we're in? And this kind of comes away a bit from your book, which, but obviously you kind of situate the end point of your presentation in the Trump victory, the recent Trump victory, election victory. And yeah, I suppose thinking about a sober assessment of where unions are, uh, like, is it a question that Eric Blanc's new book looks at this kind of union revitalization, looking at Starbucks workers, Amazon. There's a lot to be excited about, but then you kind of hit us with the kind of facts that unions are still in decline broadly. The density levels in North America still continue to decline. Yeah. I suppose I'm asking how do you kind of like speak to that? Yeah, I suppose that's a kind of, especially when you had the kind of moment of the IRA, a little, you had the job leverage, right? You had workers talking about this as a missed opportunity. Maybe I'll ask you to speak to that, and then I'll just have like three questions. Then I'll let you go. Yeah, you like, yeah, just incredible what you're doing. I suppose the first question is, around momentum. In the labor movement, we like to talk about how wins, like, they have like this kind of knock-on effect where they create other wins. Why was that not the case in your example? Like, why did these wins not have a kind of uh, infectious effect, a knock-on effect? How were they not? How are these wins not contagious? You show the kind of plateauing that happens there. Yeah, and that happens again with the kind of political orientation. And yeah, how do you, completely off topic, but how do you see the kind of something we're kind of talking about at TULE is this contradiction in the US that Adam Tooze has kind of pointed out, where you have a solar boom happening. Particularly, it's the conservative states, right? Texas are like massive wind and solar booms. States like yeah, and then but obviously you have Trump's just came in on a promise to like, and he has like halted. There's a pause on federal leases for offshore wind, which is going to have all sorts of impact. Yeah, I suppose the question is, how do you see that playing out? Do you see these right-wing governments, state governments just getting in line? Or do you see what Jeremy Breckers talks about? Do you see there's still very much a statewide opportunity at the moment? Uh, and the last question is, yeah, I suppose like you're involved in rank and file caucuses. A lot of people in this call will be involved in kind of DSA stuff, and we've not really seen, or maybe you can challenge that, but I don't think from afar we've seen that kind of Bernie moment where we've seen people like rush into DSA. We like you have like a green hushing people are talking about at the moment, rather than people jump into a kind of climate movement or labor unions. Yeah, I suppose to finish up with, with one of the easiest questions that we're all kind of grappling with, how do you kind of build that? Where should the collective power in the US be built up? Should it be in these rank and file caucuses? Should it be in DSA? Should it be in third party? And yeah, what does internationalism? Of course, we've not touched on obviously so much opportunity with supply change, so much opportunity with this work that you'll know better than most of us. Like, what does internationalism look like in this moment? But yeah, I'll stop there. And yeah, thanks so much for the talk. And yeah, really looking forward to the book. Cheers.
Thank you, Vinny. The question is, Keith, would you like to like answer now, or should we just open it up and you respond as we go along, or what would you prefer? You're muted.
Well,
Okay.
how about I say a few things in response to Vinny's really sharp
Okay.
comments, and then let's open it up and get some of you all on video,
Yes.
throwing tomatoes at
Just
me or whatever you want.
quick information for folks asking me on the chat. You'll be able to comment or ask questions in a couple of minutes. So people were eager to ask questions. So yeah, go ahead.
Excited to get to them. So yeah, I think one of the core questions I hear you asking, Vinny, is like, so what is to be done in unions to help them go further than this sort of plateau that they hit here? And I think that's sort of a core thing for all of us to be trying to research and like look for examples of where unions go further at this like membership level is sort of the key thing I'm pulling out here, that it's like without developing the political leadership and like organizing amongst the rank and file, like these unions didn't have a plan to do that beyond this sort of initial, like, let's get more union members, let's get people like mildly active in electoral politics, but there was kind of no like step 2.0 figured out beyond that. And I don't pretend to have like the perfect answer for that. I do think there are, some of these historical cases I cited, and you cited the Lucas plans as well as in the UK as examples where there's some existing practices of shop floor militancy, of workers sort of creatively talking it out with each other about how to challenge management, that I think is a really important moment of sort of that inherent tension you have with your boss trying to push you to work unsafe or overtime. And people figuring out how to challenge that collectively can be the start, it seems like, in a lot of these cases of more kind of formed politics down the line. And I think there's, real challenges to doing that in construction unions in particular, where for a long time, construction union officers and certainly many members too have seen that a sort of stable, peaceful relationship with employers is their ticket to avoiding long layoffs, to sort of like keep the boat from tipping over that already feels pretty insecure in their sector, where they're down to 10-15% union membership. However, I think there are enormous opportunities around new manufacturing getting built up right now that have not yet really been seized, to get current members involved in salting or going and helping with new organizing. There's still opportunities in the years to come because a lot of these projects are still under construction, have enough private capital that even the public capital being stalled won't totally kill them. That's the centerfold of the new labor notes issue, is looking at EV, battery, and solar manufacturing around North America, currently under construction or already completed. And I do think that this question of political alternatives or a political vehicle for unions is pretty essential too, that there's sort of this stasis in union politics, so long as the options are just propping up a loosely labor-aligned sort of center-left, or like dalliances with like sort of pretending pro-worker right wing, as we saw in this region, as we're seeing somewhat nationally. There's huge dangers there of members never being asked to sort of step up as organizers in their community, beyond maybe dropping off some campaign lit or casting a vote. I think it seems like in a bunch of unions around the country right now, been a lot of interest in the experience of the Dan Osborne campaign in Nebraska, where a union activist ran as an independent, not, a seamlessly left-wing campaign by any means, but still a very like working class versus ruling class kind of message that ended up getting really close to winning. And my understanding is now that campaign is now working with Bernie Sanders' team to try and help recruit some candidates nationally and run union activists elsewhere on independent tickets. But I think more than just sort of the formal ballot line question, it's the actual practice of building a political vehicle where members feel like we're responsible. It's our ideas that are building this that has been really absent. And in the conclusion of my book, I look at the green bands in Australia and how they did some of this, but not in the electoral realm. They were pretty syndicalist, but they did have these member-based political conversations around what do we want to build or not build, that I think are a really impressive model. And then the lack of an electoral vehicle until it was too late kind of, I think, was part of what cut them off. I also look at the Richmond Progressive Alliance here in California, which I think is a pretty exemplary example of a labor-backed, sort of independent, member-based political vehicle to learn from. But again, these are by no means complete or universal answers, but we got to look to the ones we have and try and build off them and spread them. Finally, you asked this question of like where, what is to be done beyond unions. Unions essential because of all these members and resources and potential for political formation in their ranks. I would note that I'm encouraged that DSA is currently growing at a rate it hasn't since AOC's win in 2018. That there is, I think, a hunger for a political alternative out there. And certainly there are examples of more working class or community-based environmental organizations or environmental justice groups out there in some places. But I really think that this reserve of power in unions that is untapped is like something we have to figure out how to work with in a deeper way. And I think that probably motivates a lot of us to be here in the first place, is figuring out how to do that. And I think that can be a bridge to the sort of internationalism question you raised at the end, although it's a tricky path there. Before people feel like they have some agency over their lives at work and their union's political direction, then the question of allegiances or ties overseas feels pretty abstract. But I think this debate over tariffs and the kind of vacuum of like a working class answer that I think the UAW in very partial and very imperfect ways is kind of like grasping at like we want some kind of like working class version of tariffs. Uh, this is a debate in which like researchers can contribute and be a part of member discussions. I think is kind of the key things more than just writing papers and talking with each other. We need to do that too. Let's get out and like try and find some like membership meetings in our areas where members are wondering about this, hold workshops. And I think that there's some interesting work happening in Quebec, in the UK, with aviation industry workers that I write about in the new labor notes to do workshops where you get researchers in the room to give some information and then have like very open democratic discussions among union members about like where do we want our industry to go in these new conditions that actually resemble some of the best of what happened in the oil, chemical, and atomic workers and the push that won OSHA. So don't think we have to invent it all from scratch. Let's try and dig into some of that. Cool. Excited to hear more of y'all's questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Keith. We have a couple of folks. I know that Varun has to leave, so they wanted to ask the first questions. I'm going to let them. And please, if folks can limit themselves to 2 minutes, 3 max, so that everyone gets to say something. Varun, go ahead.
Thank you, Nicole. Thanks, Keith, and everybody else in the panel for letting me go first. So really brief question. I'm doing some research on the different types of emotions that people face as they're navigating the green transitions when it comes to labor movements. It could be you getting new jobs or going from like transitioning from a carbon intensive job to a green intensive job as it is. And you mentioned that, like in Fresno, there were different types of emotions when it came to the new government being elected and how people were confronted with that. So during your study, did you notice any interesting patterns of emotions that came over when people were going through the transition phase? Was it mostly like rage? Was it consternation? Was it concern? Anxiety? Could be anything really for a wide range. Yeah, that's my question.
Thanks, Varun.
Yeah,
Nicole,
and just so folks know, you can raise your hands, and I'm gonna write it down. And yeah, go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, thanks, Varun. I do think that the like affective or like emotional dimension of politics shouldn't be, totally run over in our interest to be materialists. I think that there's the main one I thought about a lot is resignation, is like a sense that a different alternatives aren't possible, which I think is sort of the defining like emotional experience that has been engineered in the neoliberal period for us, for working people, of like the specific way I heard it a lot was the plans for the job belong to the developer. We can't challenge what this project is doing. We can't challenge what the contractors want to build. I think there is an interesting kind of sense of hope because of the public role in mandating solar construction or directly funding high-speed rail construction in California that opened up a sense of like, wait, actually, maybe we do have a bit of agency and we can have some hope that we can define our own path for work. However, I think that without a practice of challenging if you're only challenging that on the legislative level, which is very far from what most members are actually involved in any way, then members never really develop that sort of felt experience of being able to challenge managements and come up with your own ideas of how work should be run. So to me, that comes back to the importance of the experience of the freedom of telling off your boss. And it's interesting that I think there actually is a sort of very limited and individualistic form of that freedom and rebelliousness that's very common in construction work, where it's like one of the few industries where workers like routinely tell a mean boss to go F themselves or like, push back or do little forms of resistance and slowdowns. But it's often in these sort of machismo or like macho individual solutions terms of I'll walk off the job and get a new one rather than let's do something collectively. So I think there's a huge opportunity to build that sort of collective forms of resistance and a sense of freedom through that, that I see a lot of hope in some emerging reform caucuses, in particular one national one in the electrical workers that I've been trying to help support for the last few years through labor notes that it's about to go public later this year. So yeah, that, sort of let's build a collective culture of resistance, I think is key to sort of change the emotional dynamics you're speaking to.
Thank you.
Let's go with Christian, and then I'm going to read a question that we have in the chat.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Keith, for that presentation. Your point on the critique of Bidenomics and the fact that a solar boom by itself won't create this kind of class formation you're talking about is well taken, but I wanted to ask you to maybe flesh out better how Bidenomics might have empowered this kind of center-left construction politics you talk about, because there's all sorts of institutional mechanisms in the IRA, for example, and even the moderate labor standards were mostly impacting the construction workers, like prevailing wage laws, apprenticeships. There's all these kind of project labor agreements. Maybe you could flesh out a bit more to which extent these were kind of in play in this kind of dynamic and how it compared to other places in the US. And more on the institutional terrain, because it's well taken that a rank and file strategy should not overestimate the institutional terrain as being its source of fundamental power, but still the shifts in institutional terrain can impact the kind of worker organizing. So I'm just thinking about to which extent the entry of Trump and its impacts in terms of the fund freeze, the suspension of permitting, how will that affect union organizing in the energy transition? And my second comment was about your kind of typology about center-left kind of politics, but you were referencing to Gindin and Panich in the beginning of the excerpt that you sent us. But if I remember in that piece, they kind of compare that the Green New Deal or the radical left parties electorally were kind of having at best a class-focused politics rather than a class-based politics rooted in the working class. But it seemed that even the case you're telling us, it's even not at the threshold of a class focus kind of politics. It's even below it in terms of a labor sectionalism. So maybe you could flesh out also this kind of typology, the kind of, I think it could be illuminating for the kind of perspective that you're laying out us here. So I'll stop here.
Okay, I'll read the question by Peter Fugiel, and then you can go back to Keith. So Peter asks, did the workers you spoke with see overtime as more widespread or problematic with solar projects than other construction projects? Are there any project labor agreements or local unions you would point to as a model for setting effective limits on overtime in the industry? It seems like overtime is often presented as a take it or leave it decision at the time members are offered work on a particular project.
Okay, I'll start there because it's fresh in my mind. So overtime is a really tricky problem across a lot of industries right now for worker power, where I think more than has been widely reported in manufacturing, construction, and even in healthcare, there are broad trends of pretty extreme levels of overtime, of like 60-hour weeks, 70-hour weeks being mandatory in some cases, but in a lot of cases being voluntary as well. And I think Peter's question speaks to it, and Vinny as well, I think gestured to this, of like there being a significant voluntary component of how many workers opt into pretty heavy amounts of overtime as sort of their clearest path to boost their income, a bird in the hand. I think that there have been in the past occasional union efforts in the auto workers and the steel workers, formerly oil, chemical, and atomic workers, to push back against overtime offers. Most notably recently, I think during the auto workers strike, a culture of voluntary overtime refusal as a means of strike solidarity in non-striking plants was one of the most exciting sort of mass practices of solidarity that developed in non-striking plants. And it has continued in a few plants even since the strike after learning that kind of process. So like, this is a way we can like slow down production, push back against management. But I honestly don't feel like I have sufficient answers just from this research on it, because I did not find major currents of workers who were hostile to overtime or saw it as like a huge imposition on their freedom. So I think finding more examples of that out in the world and learning from them is pretty key stuff for labor research. On the question, Peter's first question of like, were there other problems of solar versus other projects? I think the major problem to understand is the repetitiveness and the simple sort of de-skilling aspect of solar work that many building trades members feel, where you're practically an installer doing the same sort of task like 200 times a day, which I've heard many workers say like, this is good for when you're just new in the field or when you're at the end of your career and need lighter work, but like it's really hard to build skills to be hireable or in demand on a wider range of construction projects if you only have a record of doing this. So, unions in construction have built a lot of their power around their sort of capacity for training and for filling a workforce reproduction gap of developing, highly trained craft workers that the private sector management has really failed at doing and acknowledges it really doesn't do as well as the union sector. So that's something that the unions, I think to their credit, are trying to make sure that the solar workers they do take on long term as full members get sort of a wider scope of training and get to cycle around some different kinds of projects and not just be permanently on solar. But that's also why this issue of a tier system of like lower tier kind of permanent solar helpers is such a crucial problem for worker power and union unity. If that becomes baked into these unions, then you have this kind of permanent underclass who's not hireable, who doesn't contribute to the leverage of the rest of the union. Christian asked some very sharp and difficult questions. I think to start with, more specifics of the Bidenomics model and how they played out. It's worth noting that the model in California, predates and is distinct in some ways from Bidenomics. It did not mandate project labor agreements or union hiring requirements for the state level. California's renewable energy laws, in fact, say nothing about labor standards, except that it needs to be in-state production for a large share of renewable energy. That goes back to a 2002 law that unions actually supported at the time, because they knew that then they could use these permit fights. Interestingly, this isn't a labor versus environment situation. This is unions using environmental permitting laws as leverage, as something to hold hostage to get what they want out of developers, which I think is a really undersung kind of labor environmental synergy with some interesting implications for the current permitting debates happening that I haven't seen anyone take up in depth. I think that a major problem for the Biden-funded projects around the country, I've seen at a lot of the major battery plant construction projects in the South, for example, is that unions suddenly get called up because there's major tax breaks for contractors to build these projects with union members. And instead of organizing new members to join the union long term, union officers in rural Kentucky say, we're not going to, great, we have a call for 2,000 electricians for the next 2 months. Amazing. But we're not going to have 2,000 jobs for electricians out here long term. So what we'll either do is just bring in travelers from other locals. So you have a tent city or a trailer city of traveling workers out there, or very temporarily sign people up who are skilled non-union electricians, but with kind of no organizing culture built, no intent to get them organizing non-union jobs when they go back to working non-union. And I think it's been a missed opportunity so far that you have thousands of non-union workers suddenly brought into unions during this boom in the South in particular. And I think it could still be seized because those contacts are all still there. And, there's been some experience of working union with now thousands more people from the non-union sector. So that's sort of the key bridge. I think it's going to be important to watch. Under Trump, high-speed rail development is stalled out. I mean, that's going to be a major hit to the unions here. And then the suspension of funding in general for green manufacturing, construction, infrastructure is, likely to really tamp down on the kind of ambition of building trades officers, and put them into a more defensive stance, as that memo I cited alludes to. The solar industry itself, it looks like it's unclear how much will be hugely affected. It's been continuing to move. It seems like the wind industry, obviously, permits have been completely blocked and stalled by the Trump administration, but that hasn't been a heavily unionized industry so far in the US. And finally, you asked about this Panich and Ginden idea of like class-focused politics versus class-rooted politics. I think that there were, in this sort of best case scenario in the San Joaquin Valley that I point to, there was a really important role played by what I think of as sort of conscious connectors, or sort of cadre of union activists, some of them in officer positions, some of them in environmental NGOs, a few of them rank and file, and some of them who became officers out of the rank and file, who had this kind of vision of we need to take on a kind of ruling class, the developer elite in local politics that has run things for a century here and been extremely anti-union. And I think one of the theses of my book is that it's actually in places where unions have been more excluded from the political settlement or from the kind of ruling political group, that they're more able to develop this kind of independent kind of class, formation idea, as like, we need to build an alternative to the political system. We need to work with the excluded working class forces here. There's something, because we're talking with a lot of Canadians here, I'll bring up like Barry Island's Labor and the Party Idea, I think is the title of his book, about why Canada.
Class idea.
Yeah, and the class idea. There we go. Thanks. Yeah, which I think is a somewhat parallel argument at a different scale, of like that exclusion from the main parties in Canada led for unions to form an alternative with something more of a fighting class politics, versus in the US, where unions get incorporated into the New Deal Democratic Party. I think that there's a lesson from that in these regional local union politics, is that there are actually, I think, pretty important opportunities in what we think of as like red areas, or areas where unions have been really repressed for a long time, where there's actually an openness and a hunger for building an alternative that can allow unions to have a breakthrough like they did in this heavily repressed area in California.
Thank you, Keith. We have a couple more minutes, 10 more minutes. If there's anyone else who has a question or a comment. If not, then I think we can close today. If there's no one else commenting or asking questions, then I
When's the book
thank.
coming out?
Yes. Well, that's no pressure, Keith.
No release date to report yet, but I won't be shy when we get there.
Yeah, we'd love to have you back once it's published, freshly published. Thanks everyone for coming. And as I mentioned in the beginning, follow us on social media, and on our website. You can also subscribe to our emails. And thank you very much. I'm going to put that information back in the chat in case you want to follow us. And yes, thank you all for coming. Have a good day and night for everyone who's in Europe.
Thank you all. Appreciate the sharp ideas and feedback.
Yeah,
Thank you, Vinny, as well.
Many
yeah,
thanks
thanks a lot,
all.
everyone. Cheers.
Bye all.